Hello everyone, welcome back to UGC 112, World Civilizations 2. This is Lecture 5, The Development of Constitutionalism. And much like last time, the development of absolutism, we're going to be talking about constitutional monarchies. Now, we're going to start today off a little bit earlier than we did in France. Remember when we looked at France and the development of absolutism? We looked right around 1600. So we're going to start off a little bit earlier in this lecture. And of course, we're not going to be in France, which is right down here. Instead, we're going to be in England, which is the bottom 2/3 of this island here. That's England. Here's Scotland up here. This is Ireland. This red thing that you see is Great Britain. But we're not there quite yet. So we're going to be talking about England, and we'll see how Scotland fits in as we go on. Now, we start off with what are called the Wars of the Roses. And these are a series of English civil wars that last from 1455 to 1487. And it gets its name from the two roses of the two lines of the royal family that are fighting each other. Here you can see the roses here and here of the two lines. This is the rose of York. This is the rose of Lancaster. Now, listen to those names, York and Lancaster. This is actually, this whole lecture is going to be very influential to A Song of Ice and Fire, and, obviously then the Game of Thrones series. York, Stark, Lancaster, Lannister. This is going to be a very big inspiration for that series. Now, the Wars of the Roses basically ends in 1485. You can see that, there's 2 more years where it's kind of still going on, but for all intents and purposes, it ends in 1485 when Richard III, right here, of York, dies in the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. And so he's fighting Henry Tudor, who has a claim to the throne on the Lancaster side. They fight this big battle, and Richard III dies in it. Also, a few years ago, you may have heard that they actually found Richard's body underneath a parking lot in the area that was, developed later. So, his body was found just a few years ago. After the Battle of Bosworth Field, Henry Tudor, he's able to then claim the throne. He does have a claim through the Lancaster line, and he will thus start the Tudor dynasty. He's the first Tudor king of England. Much like we saw where Henri in France was the first Bourbon king, here we see another Henry being the first of the Tudor dynasty. He did have a claim to the throne, but it was really rather weak. His connection was through his mother, which was, when the line's coming through a woman, the English would much prefer at this time that it be coming through the father, not the mother. And then even worse, the line from his mother was through an illegitimate child. I think it was her grandfather, was the illegitimate child of this royal line. The mother later would be, the child later would be, kind of legitimized, but at the time he was born out of wedlock. So technically an illegitimate child. So Henry's line, or his connection to the royal family is kind of weak. His claim on the throne is weak. He's also half Welsh, which is a bit of a trouble for the English at this point. Being part Welsh is not the greatest thing. So because of the weak claim to the throne, and on top of all these years of civil war, Henry really needed to curb the power of the nobles. And this is really similar to what we saw in France under Henri, right? That comes a little bit later, but this Henry is still, he's got similar ideas to that the later Henri would have. He tries to improve the economy and the tax system. He does this by standardizing weights and measures, and in doing so, he's hoping that this would also then improve the royal treasury and the resources of the crown. Now, also like France of Henri, the nobles controlled the army, right? This is due to those feudal ties. So the nobles are in control of the army. Henry decides that he needs to have some military power of his own. He wants to create a navy, and the idea is that this navy would be loyal to him. But, you know, navies are expensive. He starts to build them, but they're really, really expensive. And here you can see there's Henry there with the Tudor rose. Another big, you know, focal point of Henry's rule is he wants to improve the standing of his family in society. Their claim to the throne, he wants to, you know, have it set in stone. He wants to be able to pass it on to his children. And he tries to do this first through marrying his son Arthur to Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon is the daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand of Spain. Remember, the ones who unified Spain in 1492, would, you know, send off Columbus that year too. Their daughter, Catherine of Aragon, is married to Arthur, the son of Henry VII. Both Arthur and Catherine at this time are children, so the marriage, you know, they're not going to consummate the marriage right away because they're children. And in fact, Arthur dies before he's able to consummate the marriage, which is going to be a bit of a tricky thing, right? So basically, at this point, the marriage is null and void. At least from the Spanish can claim it that way. Henry can see the ties starting to loosen. So what does he do? He has his younger son, who he had named Henry, marry Catherine of Aragon. So instead of, you know, being married to Arthur anymore, she's now married to his younger son, Henry. On top of this, you know, besides kind of a marriage alliance kind of with Spain, Henry is also going to remove rivals. Basically, if you had a claim to the throne, you could be in danger of being imprisoned or even killed, you know, unless you stayed loyal. So people with a stronger claim or as strong a claim, you know, it was kind of a perilous situation for them. Through these methods, Henry VII was able, in fact, to pass on the throne to his son, Henry VIII. So, you know, that part of his reign was successful, passes it on to his son, Henry VIII, who becomes king at the age of 17. And this picture here is Henry VIII at 17. You know, this picture commemorates his coronation. And again, we can see him holding that Tudor rose, right? It's going to be kind of one of the major themes of early Tudor paintings. A way of, like, asserting that they are the royal family. Now, as a young man, Henry VIII was known as very charismatic and very athletic. He was an extremely good jouster. He also was an author and a composer. But in 1536, he was involved in a jousting accident that seriously hurt his leg. He was in constant pain from this. He wasn't able to, you know, really, he wasn't as mobile anymore, and it took a great toll on him physically as well as psychologically. He became obese, and then over time became known more for being lustful and egotistical and harsh and insecure. And for those of you, again, thinking about Game of Thrones, does this remind you of anyone? Maybe Robert Baratheon, right? The great athlete as a young man, a warrior, and then kind of becomes a drunken, old, lustful king. Henry VIII continued many of his father's policies. He tried to keep building up that navy. Again, very, very expensive to do so. He also tried to fight some wars in Europe. Not overly successful in doing so. It was kind of a dream that he'd be able to expand England into Europe and, at least their influence down there. But again, not overly successful. Also, like his father, he was highly concerned with strengthening and continuing his family line, making sure that, the Tudor dynasty would keep going after him. We said that he married Catherine of Aragon after his brother died. Remember, they're both very young, they're children at first, but he'll grow into it. And together, not super successful in creating a solid line. She would give birth to 3 stillborn children, which included 2 boys of those, and she also gave birth to a son, Henry, who only survived 52 days. She did have a daughter, who died within a week. That's not good either. And she did have 1 surviving child, a daughter named Mary. So, out of all those pregnancies, only 1 child survived, and it was a girl. Henry, of course, wanted a son to pass the throne on to, and he knows he can have a son because, in fact, he had an illegitimate son with one of the attendants of Catherine, a boy named Henry Fitzroy, Fitz being bastard, Roy being from the French word king, roi. So there was this kind of noble guy who, he becomes a noble because he's the illegitimate son of Henry. So he knows he can have a boy, but Catherine's just not giving it to him. There, are all these children dying or being stillborn. And so he decided that something was up. He says, you know what? She was married to my brother Arthur. God is punishing us for that. Even though they never consummated it, he started to say, this is incest. But this was all just a ploy to actually replace Catherine of Aragon, right? She wasn't giving him a son. He just really wanted to replace her. He's going to use this reason of God punishing them because of the marriage to Arthur, as an excuse to do so. And so he asked the Pope for an annulment, which was pretty common. In fact, if you think back to last lecture, I made the point of when Henri of France was married to Margaret and they got an annulment in 1599 so that he could marry Marie de Medici in 1600. So this is pretty common, and we saw it successfully happen then. But there's one major difference here. When Henry asks for this annulment of the Pope, there's a Holy Roman Emperor by the name of Charles V. This Charles V happened to be the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. So he's Catherine's nephew, and he also happened to have basically put the Pope under house arrest in Rome. So the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who is the nephew of Catherine, has the Pope in his pocket. Do you think he's going to let Henry divorce his aunt? No. And so the Pope then, under extreme pressure from Charles V, says, Henry, you cannot divorce Catherine. I cannot grant you this annulment. Now, Henry VIII is a man of reason and tolerance, right? Oh wait, no, we said that he was egotistical and rash and a man very, very, set on getting his way. So what does he do? Henry decides that he's going to divorce the Pope. If the Pope won't grant his divorce, he's just going to divorce himself from the Pope. And in doing so, he founds the Church of England. He says that the churches in England no longer will recognize the Pope, and in fact, they're going to have their own Pope. This leader of the new Church of England is going to be the Archbishop of Canterbury. He will be the Pope for the Church of England. And that's kind of true, right? The Archbishop of Canterbury just kind of fills this role. There's one major difference. The Pope is chosen by, votes of members of the clergy. The person who chooses the Archbishop of Canterbury is Henry VIII. So, who's actually the head of the church? Theoretically, if you want to, you can say it's the Archbishop of Canterbury, but since Henry's the one who can choose to remove him at any time, it's actually Henry. Henry's the one in charge. He's the head of the church. Other than that, there are not many changes to the Church of England, from Catholicism. There are some minor changes to liturgy and practice, like, the Bible and prayers are going to be in English. But overall, it's still pretty similar in terms of, practice of the church. Over time, Henry's also going to seize the monasteries that were in England. So he'll seize the land, he'll seize the property, he'll seize everything they own, and then he's going to keep it for himself. So the king gets richer this way. He's able to, fund a lavish lifestyle that he has while also trying to build up the navy and whatnot. He also divorces Catherine, right? Now that the Pope has no say in what the Church of England says, he says, hey, Archbishop of Canterbury, the guy I can replace at any time, I'm going to divorce Catherine. And the Archbishop of Canterbury, of course, says, sure, yeah. Now, Catherine of Aragon was not allowed to return to Spain, where her parents were. Instead, she's basically forced to live the rest of her life under house arrest in different castles throughout England. Henry wouldn't let Mary see her mother, and so Catherine of Aragon isn't allowed to see, her daughter Mary or anything like that. And despite this, throughout her lifetime, she continues to call herself Henry's lawful wife and queen until she died in 1536. So, a rather strong woman who really, didn't recognize this whole divorce. And here in this picture we see the Cathedral of Canterbury, which is just southwest of London. So there's the cathedral there, and here is where Canterbury is. There's London, of course, where the king presides. Now, Henry VIII is probably best known for his wives. We've already talked about Catherine of Aragon, how she was only able to give one daughter, who survived, Mary. Next up came Anne Boleyn, who was Catherine's lady-in-waiting, which is the main attendant of Catherine of Aragon. She was a noble. She gives birth to Elizabeth. That's a good thing. She also has 3 miscarriages. And she gets this reputation for being a little wild, basically Henry only sees the daughter, sees the miscarriages, and he needs reason to divorce her. But he goes a little bit further than with Catherine of Aragon. She's only English. She's not going to cause a war between Spain or anything like Catherine of Aragon might have. So she's charged with high treason due to adultery, incest, and plotting to kill the king. The last 2 of these charges are especially not convincing, but, Henry VIII says this is what she did, so she is still found guilty, and then she is beheaded after serving 3 years as queen, 1533 to 1536. So poor Anne Boleyn gives Elizabeth, but then gets beheaded. Next up, Jane Seymour. And look at this. Jane Seymour actually gave Henry a boy, a young son named Edward. Everything is going to be great, right? Not so great that Jane dies from complications giving birth to Edward. So she's only queen from 1536 to 1537, when unfortunately she died from complications due to childbirth, giving birth to Edward. Henry now needs a new queen. Next up, Anne of Cleves. Anne of Cleves, she's a princess from a Protestant German state, and in part she's chosen because Henry's hoping to create an alliance with Protestant German countries against the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, right? Remember Catherine's nephew? Still upset at Henry for, divorcing his aunt. And so Henry thinks that, he can kind of create an alliance with these many different German Protestant states. And there's also an element that's kind of like online dating here. So Henry gets a picture of Anne of Cleves, and it's like she took a selfie from a really flattering angle, and then she used a filter that really, washed out it so you couldn't see the imperfections or anything like that. And it's not quite exactly how she looks in person. So when she arrives, the picture, she doesn't quite look like she did in the picture, and Henry's not very impressed. They're married for 7 months in the year 1540, and supposedly they never consummated the marriage, so of course this marriage is easily annulled. She gets, Henry divorces her, but Henry actually really did like her as a person. In fact, after they're divorced, Henry declares her the king's beloved sister. So he treated her like a sister. And throughout her life, or, while Henry's alive, Anne continued to push Henry to remarry her. Basically, he put her in the friend zone. She's still trying to get him to remarry her, but she kind of gets the last laugh, as she's going to outlive all the other wives. So, Anne of Cleves, divorced. What are we going to do next? Well, so far we've had a Catherine, an Anne, a Jane, an Anne. Who can we have next? How about another Catherine? This Catherine is, in fact, Catherine Howard, a cousin of Anne Boleyn. Again, kind of similar to her cousin. She gets a reputation for being wild. She's convicted of high treason for adultery after 16 months of marriage, and she is beheaded. So, 16 months from 1540 to 1541, and she ends up losing her head, just like her cousin Anne Boleyn. So now we have a Catherine, an Anne, a Jane, another Catherine. Who's going to be next? Well, how about another Catherine? Yeah, English names are almost as bad as French royalty names. They're all Catherines, Annes, Henrys, just like how French kings are always like Louis. So Catherine Parr is the next Queen of England, and she actually will outlive Henry. Henry dies in 1547, so she's queen 1543 to 1547, doesn't have any children, and she will die 1 year later in 1548. But Henry VIII, now gone. Who are we going to choose, right? There are 3 legitimate children that Henry has. He has Mary, the eldest, Elizabeth, and Edward, who is only 9 years old at this time. What do we do? Well, I think the obvious choice is... No, it wasn't Mary, it was Edward, I guess. Edward, sickly child, grew up always kind of sick. He's only 9 years old, but he's a boy. So he becomes king. Like his father, he was also Protestant, and he really pushes the Protestant, he pushes the church to become more and more Protestant. His advisors and he do this through changes like masses have to be in English now, and there's a new prayer book that's developed under Edward. And this is also where the idea that in the Catholic Church, when you have communion, the belief is that the bread and the wine actually become the body of Christ. At this point, during Edward's reign, is when the Church of England says, no, that's not how it works. God is not actually in the bread or the wine. They are symbolic. They're not, there's no transubstantiation. They do not become the blood and body of Christ. Instead, they are just a metaphor. Being a sickly child, Edward, not surprisingly, dies at the age of 15. But before he died, Edward obviously had some foresight, and he decided to choose who was going to be the next ruler of England. Is it going to be Mary? Is it going to be Elizabeth? It's actually going to be neither. He decides to choose his cousin, Jane Grey, so another woman. He chooses her over his two own sisters to be the next ruler of England, but she is only going to rule for 9 days before she loses the support, and people begin to instead support Mary. So Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, like her mother, she is Catholic, and she tries to erase all the changes that her brother Edward and her father Henry had made. She tries to make the country Catholic. She also married Philip of Spain, so he's a prince of Spain, and she began to make alliances with other Spanish countries in Europe. Obviously, when you try and make the country Catholic again, she got rid of Edward's reforms, and she went further than that. She persecuted Protestants and even would execute many, many of them. And it is never a really good way of converting people, to kill them. Killing people, surprisingly, does not change those people's minds. So instead, people start to, dislike her quite a bit. She wasn't very popular, and she gets the nickname Bloody Mary because of this, because of all these executions. And again, she didn't really change many people's minds. Now, all the history books are going to tell you that she died, possibly of uterine cancer at the age of 42 in 1558. But this is going to be a little bit crazy sounding. Here's my theory for what actually happened with Mary. She actually figured out a way to time travel, and she went into the future and became the 38th president of the United States, Gerald Ford. Look at that. It's uncanny. I can't even tell which one's which anymore. This one here, I see the American flag, and there's that Tudor rose. So this one has to be Mary. This one's Gerald Ford, but goodness gracious. Like, if those weren't there, I don't know who would be who. After Mary dies, we see the reign of her younger half-sister, Elizabeth. She's Protestant like her father. She decides that the Church of England should be, reinstated. But unlike Mary, she is going to be really, really tolerant of Catholics. She saw how, killing off people isn't really a good way to rule, doesn't really get you much way in the way of support. So she begins to tolerate Catholics and it's kind of encapsulated in this Latin phrase, video et taceo, which means I see and I remain silent. So, she sees that Catholics are still practicing, but she's not going to, say or do anything about it. Here is, of course, Elizabeth in her coronation regalia. She can see she's got, her hand on this globe. She's holding a scepter. A very, very young woman as queen, and she's going to have a long reign. The early challenges when she became queen were that she had very little money. The building of a navy and that lavish lifestyle that Henry lived and the reforms that Edward had done had kind of sucked a lot of the money out of the royal purse. The army really didn't exist, right? Because the nobles were in control of raising the army, still because of those feudal ties. She had that small navy from the developments of Henry VII and Henry VIII, but because it was so expensive, it was still really, really small. And then, once Mary died, Philip, her husband, had gone back to Spain. The Spanish aren't really happy that there's now a Protestant queen on the throne. They'd much rather have another Catholic on there. So there are some troubles with Spain based on, Elizabeth being Protestant, and still some ill feelings towards the way that Catherine of Aragon had been treated. So, in order to meet some of these challenges, Elizabeth gets creative. And one of the things she does is she takes these royal progresses. Now, a royal progress is a long trip that goes throughout the entire country of England. And while she's on these trips, she forces the local nobles to spend their money to feed and to house Elizabeth and her court. And she might stay there for an extended amount of period on these long progresses, right? She might just hole up with a noble for a while. In doing so, she saves her own money, right? She's not living in London. She's not forced to pay for her own upkeep or that of her court, because they're all being paid for by the noble while she's spending time with them. And since she's living with those nobles, she's also able to watch over them and the armies that they can raise. And in this way, she can ensure loyalty. It's kind of like when we talked about Louis XIII and Cardinal Richelieu and how they had intendants to watch over the nobles in those different districts. Elizabeth is actually watching them herself when she goes on these progresses. Another plus side of these royal progresses are that the common people are able to see her on these long parades. She's out and about in the community, and seeing royalty is something really, really special, and it creates this sense of loyalty among the common people too. So this adds to almost a rock star persona, or persona of Elizabeth, and we'll get into that a little bit in just a little bit. So that takes care of the not having much money and the questionable loyalty of the nobles and the army that they control these progresses. Now, with that small navy and the troubles with Spain, Elizabeth's solution is the use of privateers. Now, a privateer is an individual who owned their own battleship. And what she would do is she would allow these privateers to commit piracy against Spanish and French ships. So she was perfectly fine with them, attacking Spanish and French ships, and she would take a percentage of whatever they stole from these ships. Kind of like, remember when Henry the Navigator gave explorers money and he expected some money, he expected 20% in return? Elizabeth gives permission for these English sea captains, these privateers, to go out and steal from the Spanish and the French, and she's going to want a percentage of what they stole. Now, if these privateers were ever caught by the Spanish or the French, one nice thing about it is she could deny that, they ever worked for her. She'd be like, those are just pirates. Of course they're not working for me. I'm a queen. I'm not going to employ pirates. So she could deny that these guys were ever working for her if they were caught. Some of the money that she was raising through these privateers and through saving up her own funds from, due to the royal progresses, she was able to give to the Dutch. The Dutch were pretty much off and on fighting the French and the Spanish, so she would give them a little bit of money to, fight stronger against the French and the Spanish. Here we see in the picture Sir Francis Drake, one of the most famous privateers of all time. He would, in fact, like I said, his name is Sir Francis Drake, he would be knighted, and he actually became second in command during a very famous incident, the Spanish invasion of 1588. So, at the time, the Spanish Armada was the most feared navy in the world. They had used it to gain control of much of the New World, and they'd become very wealthy from the New World. They had invested a lot into this gigantic fleet of warships. And the Spanish Armada here was going to be used to protect an invasion force of 20,000 troops. So these troops would come on these transport ships that were protected by the Armada. The English Navy met with the Armada, and they were able to nullify the advantages of the Spanish fleet, and were actually able to defeat the Spanish in battle, and the Spanish then were forced to sail north through the North Sea up around Scotland to try and get home. So they have to do like a big circle around the island of Britain to try and get back home to Spain. And while they're doing that, they are hit by a storm, and it just destroys a lot of their ships, this giant storm off the coast of Scotland. So Elizabeth here, in this painting, in fact, you can see really, really telling image. Here is her fleet, and there's the storm that defeated the Spanish Armada. We can also see, besides, the references to the defeat of the Spanish Armada, we can see all this handmade lace, all these pearls in her hair. The headdress has pearls, all these pearls on her dress, much like we saw with Marie de Medici. This is a sign of great wealth and great power, on top of, hey, I just defeated the Armada. And much like the de Medici and, the urban nobility, Elizabeth supported artists, poets, and writers. And remember how when we looked at the Renaissance and we looked at the de Medici and how they had been painted into that painting of the three kings, right? Instead of the three kings, the de Medici family had been painted into it. Well, Elizabeth supports these artists, and in return, they portray her in a very, very positive light, this almost mythical Gloriana figure, right? I mean, you see in this painting here just the power that she shows, the wealth, and there are poems and plays written about her, or, written kind of about her, and this figure of Gloriana, who is the mother of the nation. So Elizabeth is, like I said, kind of like a rock star in many senses. The art community is just supporting her like crazy. She's a PR genius, is what she is. Now, as mother of the nation and a woman of such power, she never really wanted to give up complete control, and so she never married. And thus, never marrying, she never had any kids, so no heirs. What is going to happen after Elizabeth, right? There's no one left. She doesn't have any more sisters or brothers. They've all died. So the crown is going to pass on to her distant cousin, James, who is currently the King of Scotland. He is a distant cousin. He's the great-great-grandson of Henry VII, so, kind of removed from Elizabeth. But like I said, he's in many ways like Henri. Remember how Henri was the King of Navarre before he became the King of France? This is James, who's the King of Scotland, and then he will also become the King of England. And so we see the United Kingdom forming, because the king now is the King of both Scotland and England. He is a Protestant, and he continued to push for more and more religious reforms. In fact, if you've heard of the King James Bible, well, this is the King James from that Bible. Because he kept pushing for greater reforms, he upset a lot of Catholics, and in fact, the gunpowder plot was against James. Catholics tried to blow him up under Parliament. They stacked a bunch of gunpowder and were going to light it up. Guy Fawkes, of course, was the plan was leaked, and Guy Fawkes was arrested. He became this, this martyr for that Catholic cause, and they still burn Guy Fawkes in effigy in England. And this incident would also be the influence for V for Vendetta, the graphic novel, and then the movie. So that's James there. James also, he had a little bit of troubles ruling with Parliament. Over time, the House of Commons, which was one of the two bodies of Parliament, had been gaining more and more control over the finances of England, over the royal purse. And so you kind of needed them to rule. James would try to rule without Parliament, and he looked for other ways to raise money, but in general, he was able to work with the House of Commons to, more or less successfully rule England. Now, this bottom note here is about, it's a group called the Puritans, and the Puritans are English Protestants who just absolutely hated Catholicism. They always felt that the Church of England was too Catholic. As the name suggests, they wanted a pure faith, and they thought by that, the way to make it pure was to, base it on what the Bible said. So the Bible is the most important part of religion, and in fact, the ritual should just be done away with. And so if there were rituals in the Anglican Church, in the Church of England, that always was way too Catholic for them. And over time, these Puritans were entering the House of Commons, and then later the House of Lords, and becoming a greater and greater political power in their extreme religious views. So James I worked decently well with Parliament and with this growing Puritan base. Unfortunately, his son, who took over as king after he died, didn't quite work as well with Parliament. He always wanted more money. He hated that the House of Commons had control of the finances. And he also believed that he was chosen by God to rule, this idea of divine right. And in many ways, we could see that he wanted to be like an absolute monarch. Remember, this is the time when Louis XIII is king, and then the early reign of Louis XIV in France. So in France, the kings have been getting more and more powerful. He wants to be more and more powerful. He wants to become basically an absolute monarch, even if that isn't quite clear what that is. He wants, basically what we would call an absolute monarchy. He married Henrietta Maria of France. This is the daughter of Henri IV and Marie de Medici, so he marries their daughter. And obviously, being from France and being the daughter of Marie de' Medici, she was very, very Catholic. In fact, some Catholics who left England, they felt persecuted. They left England for the New World, and they settled into what is now the United States. At the time was just colonies, and they founded the colony of Maryland and named it after her middle name, Maria. So Maryland is actually named after the wife of Charles I. But because she was so Catholic, you can imagine that Charles I was pretty tolerant, right? Generally, you don't do things that make your spouse upset. That's not a really good way to live, especially if you want a happy home life. Sure, he wants to be an absolute monarch, but this is his queen we're talking about. So he was pretty tolerant of Catholics, and thus the Puritans hated him because he was so tolerant. So he doesn't work well with Parliament. At one time, he tries to rule without them, and so the Puritans hate him because he's tolerant of Catholics. And what we see then is this, distrust and this hatred of Charles fully develop into an English Civil War. This lasts from 1642 to roughly 1651. In it, the armies of Parliament defeated the armies of Charles I, and they decide to put Charles I on trial. So he's put on trial, he's found guilty of treason, and executed. Now just think about that for 1 second. The King of England is found guilty of treason. In many ways, before this, people had been thinking that the king or the queens, they were the country, right? I mean, they were so closely tied that how could a king or a queen commit treason? And this leads to some really big questions. And in fact, no monarch in Europe is happy about this situation at all. They're upset that a king was put on trial in the first place, that he was found guilty of treason, and that he was then beheaded for it. Even if they didn't like Charles, even if they hated England, and they, generally would like England to be in, just to be a mess, this could potentially raise questions about their own legitimacy. So it's a big moment when Charles is put on trial and beheaded. After Charles is executed, Parliament decided to take over and try to rule as a republic. This is 1649 when they try to rule as a republic, but in general, they were very, very ineffective. Couldn't get much done. And in 1653, a member of Parliament and a general in that parliamentary army, Oliver Cromwell, becomes Lord Protector. And basically, as Lord Protector, this is a military dictatorship. He's a Puritan, and all decisions basically go through him. So let's think about this for 1 second here. Parliament just executed Charles I for trying to be an absolutist, an absolute monarch, right? And that was part of the problem. The tolerance to Catholics was another, but he tried to rule without Parliament, and, in general, he just kind of felt that he was God's chosen. Now here we have Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector. Really, all decisions are going through him. Parliament exists, but, they definitely play a back seat towards this protector, this, basically, like I said, a military dictator. And that's the way it goes until 1658 when he dies. He decided to pass on the office of Lord Protector to his son Richard Cromwell. That doesn't go too well. And in fact, Parliament is going to overthrow Richard, and they will try to rule as a republic again for a brief amount of time when he proved to be weak. This is Oliver Cromwell here. The phrase warts and all is actually attributed to him because supposedly a painter, asked him, how he wanted to be portrayed, and he supposedly said, and warts and all, and you can see there's one of the warts of Oliver Cromwell. May or may not be true, but it's a little fun story. So we have Richard Cromwell, the new Lord Protector, overthrown by Parliament. There's that republic they're trying to be again. And in 1660, Parliament decides that, things are not working well. They are going to ask Charles I's son, Charles, so he's the son of Charles, to return from France and become king. So during the time of Charles I's reign, his two sons, Charles and James, had been living in France during that Civil War. Parliament then asks Charles II to return from France and become king. You can imagine that Charles II would be really upset with the people that killed his father, maybe once a lot of blood. But instead, Charles II is generally not vengeful. He realizes that it would be a really big mistake if he just started, going on witch hunts for these people. Instead, he's very forgiving, except for those directly responsible for his father's death. So, if you were part of the trial and you voted against him, if you found him guilty, then, you'd be killed. Or if you signed off on the death certificate, you'd be killed. He was a Protestant, but in general, he was very tolerant of Catholics. Now, because of the Lord Protectorship of Cromwell, the Puritans had maybe a little less say. So the tolerance towards Catholics was not a terrible thing at this point. It wasn't definitely enough to overthrow the person that you just invited to be king. Unfortunately, Charles II died without an heir. He had no children, so no heir, and the throne then passes on to his younger brother, James. So James II becomes king. Like I said, he had grown up in France, right? He was a young boy when his father was in the Civil War. So he and his older brother, Charles II, had grown up in France, and because he was so young, he was actually Catholic, right? So he was growing up in France during the time of Cardinal Richelieu and Cardinal Mazarin. So it's not surprising that, he would be very, very, at least sympathetic to Catholics, if not Catholic himself. And he was Catholic. And just as the French had been doing, appointing Catholics to all those positions in government, that's what James starts to do as well. James begins to put Catholics into positions of government. He removes laws that were discriminating against Catholics and other people who were not in the Church of England. And like Louis XIV in France, he tried to grow the standing army, right? He sees the threat of those nobles. He saw how they raised an army and were able to defeat his father's force. So he tries to create a standing army just like Louis XIV did. And it was these actions of being Catholic, giving positions to Catholics in his government, and trying to create a standing army that made the nobles of England not trust him, right? They saw him as this, really, he had been badly influenced by France. So, what they do is the English Protestant nobles invited William of Orange, which is a country around the Netherlands today, to invade. William had married James's daughter, Mary, so William was in fact James's son-in-law. So the English nobles invite him to invade. I mean, this is like if, I don't know, some presidential candidate just asked a foreign country, let's just say Russia, to hack his opponent's emails or something like that. They just convicted Charles I of treason for trying to be an absolute monarch. Then they lived under Oliver Cromwell for a few years, and now they're going and inviting another ruler of another country to come in and invade their country. This is really, really borderline, this is not normal activity at all, basically, is what I'm saying. And in fact, in many ways, they seem to be the ones who are committing treason and almost hypocritical, really. So, James tries to gather up his army to fight William, and unfortunately for him, many of his officers desert him and instead join William's invasion force. So, James loses his officers. Without an army, he's forced to flee France, and now William and Mary, yes, this is William and Mary that the college in Virginia are named after, William and Mary are made king and queen of England. But they're not just going to be any special, any of the regular types of kings and queens that we've seen so far. Parliament then has them become constitutional monarchs, meaning that they are not the owners of the states, as many of the kings and queens had kind of seen themselves before. Instead, they were the first servants of the states, right? They should be acting always on behalf of the state, and they are always obliged to do what the state sees fit, and is what is best for the state, not the best for them. And in doing so, they agree to let Parliament have a very large say in the government and in the ruling of England. And this is a major step into what we see how England develops its monarchy and how it becomes what it is today, the constitutional monarchy. This is the start of that constitutional monarch system. So we end today this lecture on the Glorious Revolution. For the next lecture, we're going to be looking at a different type of revolution, that of the Scientific Revolution. This is Greg, signing off.